Morning, friends. We're missing, I guess, some of those people who had to go back to work last night, the bank holiday having passed over. But it's a great pleasure to see that many of you are still here, and I hope you bear with us as we shift the format a little bit. I'm going to make a presentation today, and then we'll go back to the 50-50 share tomorrow, and Joni will be doing the wind-up on Thursday. Now, we've talked about the person of Baha'u'llah and his role. Through the message to the kings, we've talked about the revelation and some of his message. Today we're going to be looking at the impact of that message on the world. And as you'll recall, the conclusion from yesterday's discussion about the messages to the kings is that the privilege of carrying the faith and responding to the faith and carrying it around the world was reserved for the meek and lowly, for the rank and file members of the human race. So today we're actually going to have a look at what the meek and lowly achieved, what the extraordinary achievement of the meek and lowly with divine assistance. Or maybe it's more proper to say what the divine power achieved through the meek and the lowly. My approach is going to be a little different from what you may have been used to, because in order again to, as we search for the language to present these things to the wider society, it's sometimes useful not to use the ages and epochs that make sense to us, but rather to try to convey it through maps and facts and figures that people can accept as neutral evidence. And that way, I mean, at the same time, it helps us get a different perspective and helps us to see ourselves as others see us, and also communicate who we are and what this story in terms that are more easily acceptable sometimes to the wider society. In 1912, when Abdu'l-Baha was in Washington, D.C., in one of his talks, he said, "In this world we judge a cause or movement by its progress and development." Then he describes different types of movements that do not last. Then he says, then there is still another kind of movement or cause which from a very small, inconspicuous beginning goes forward with sure and steady progress, gradually broadening and widening until it has assumed universal dimensions. The Baha'i movement is of this nature. Now, one of the things when we're studying the spread of the faith is that we need to try to avoid this sort of hindsight that tells us, of course. It's too simple, we take for granted because we know the outcome. And one of the ways is to just think about what it would be like if you were the only Baha'i in the world. We put a star here somewhere in Canada, but it could be anywhere. And you had all the responsibility for spreading this extraordinary message. Now you'd be facing, if you had the clear view of it, a couple of really unusual challenges. One is that you have a glorious message to spread, but with very strict limitations on how it is to be spread. We know that people naturally resist change, and that power structures feel threatened and react defensively. And we must overcome these obstacles without recourse to violence, political manipulations, media tricks, superstar charisma, or material incentives. All of the tools that we see used all around us in the world. So many people might say that's mission impossible. But there's another challenge, which is how to reach all the world's people without being appropriated by one nation or culture or faction, or even worse, becoming an instrument to be used or an object to be fought over in their endless squabbles. So where a natural instinct might lead us to group, any minority group, to move together for safety and comfort, here the need from the beginning is to disperse and fly, in a sense, under the radar of the political structures and avoiding that sort of gathering together defensively. Now, in studying this, I invented a little bit my own periods, which I think express the way this growth took part. And I've sort of divided it into four groups. We're talking about the first 150 years of the faith, from 1844 to 1892. So there's a period which is primarily characterized by the revelation itself and the violent repression. It is the ministries of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. It's 48 years, where the spread of the faith is actually driven by that repression and persecution. Then there's this remarkable period which coincides with the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha, where the faith transcends its initial cultural matrix and geographical area of the Middle East and spreads to the West and to many other parts of the world. This is quite an extraordinary thing in itself. There are many religious movements in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but all of them remained within their own cultural matrix. Movements within Christianity, within Islam, within Judaism, which remained within that general framework. And the Baha'i faith is really the only one that transcended and actually became universal. Then there's the period of Shoghi Effendi, where the Baha'i faith spreads geographically into the farthest corners of the earth. And then another period which I've called putting flesh on the bones, where the numbers, the size of the community grew very significantly. So if we start with this, the first period of revelation and repression, and we have large numbers of Baha'is, followers of the faith in Iran at the beginning, mostly Muslims, but then also some Jews, Zoroastrians, and a trickle of Christians. And it's worth remembering that there were not just thousands, but tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And of course, that's what sparked the repression. And on the one hand, you have the exiles of Baha'u'llah through to the Ottoman Empire and through different parts of it, but you also had Baha'is crossing over the border to the north of Iran into Turkmenistan and starting the community in Ishkabad. So these two items, the flight from repression and the exiles of Baha'u'llah, were the primary factors in the spread of the faith during this period. These are roughly the geographical area of spread during this period. Today it's 15 countries with modern borders, but at that time it was really essentially the empires of Iran and the Ottoman Empire, with two notable exceptions, which were in the British and Russian empires. So this was a period of empires, perhaps one of the reasons Baha'u'llah wrote to the emperors. The two exceptions were India and Burma. The Afnan family had a business outpost in Mumbai, then Bombay, in the 1850s. Jamal Effendi, who is here, was sent by Baha'u'llah to teach in that area in 1875 and was travel teaching there. Syed Mustafa Rumi enrolled in Calcutta about 1878 and settled in Rangoon, teaching also in Mandalay. We all know that the casket of the Bab was made in Mandalay, and this was the area where he had been teaching in this very early period. The entire village of Daidanau, converted to the Baha'i faith, was called Abdu'l-Baha's village. So these things were really going on very early in the 19th century. I've mentioned already Ishkabad, that's the other exception. There were 1,000 Baha'is in Ishkabad by 1890, but there are also Baha'is in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and of course Turkmenistan. At this point, there was not a single believer in the West, but some things were preparing the West. E.G. Browne, as a scholar, came and visited with Baha'u'llah at Baji. Nicolas was writing, and Tolstoy. The German Templars in Haifa published the first article about the Baha'i Faith in their magazine, also during this period. So we have this spread essentially pushed by the persecutions, but still essentially within the Middle East and within these four empires. And that's what led up. So the next stage is really the what I've called the breakout. And there were a number of factors in that. Ottoman Palestine, geographically, was an extraordinary jumping off point. I remember that Baha'u'llah was exiled there involuntarily. He was sent by hostile sovereigns, but it was not only the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, but it was also an extraordinary place that was really the bridge between the East and the West. And that had a lot to do with the steamships plying the Mediterranean, which started just about the time that Baha'u'llah was arriving there. In fact, he arrived by a steamship, one of the early ones. So that was one factor. In terms of times, Abdul Baha, of course, was a prisoner until the Young Turks revolt in 1908. So that was kind of a trigger in terms of time. But there was only, if you think of it, a 6-year window of opportunity between 1908 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. So in all of history, this window of opportunity between the Young Turks revolt and the outbreak of World War I was the opportunity to break out of the Middle East and spread to the rest of the world. Now, the story of the spread to the rest of the world is itself quite extraordinary. Obviously, I can't go into great detail now, but some of the key figures was Khairullah, who's pictured here, and his buddy Haddad, and they were Lebanese Maronite Christians who happened to be studying in Egypt, met some Persian Baha'is in Egypt. The Persian Baha'is didn't speak Arabic. The Khairullah and Haddad spoke Arabic and some English because they'd studied at the Protestant college in Beirut, but they didn't speak Persian. Somehow they understood enough of the faith to become convinced but as we found out later, their understanding was a little shallow in some respects. But nonetheless, these two gentlemen who were quite intent on seeking their fortune went to America and arrived in Chicago a year before the World Exposition there, when the faith was first mentioned by Reverend Jessup, who quoted the words of E.G. Browne in a paper that was read at the Columbian Exposition. Now, Thornton Chase, the first American believer, was there. Khairullah started teaching his courses, and within a few years there were hundreds and then up to 1,000 believers in North America. And the first Western pilgrims, this is actually a picture of part of the first pilgrimage group, actually in Iran. You can see there's Phoebe Hearst's group and her butlers up there on the left, one of the first African American, probably the first African American believer. Now, there's at the same time, or in connection with this, actually it was connected with this first pilgrimage, there was a connection with essentially the American community in Paris. It was composed of students and artists and writers were in Paris. And the pilgrimage stopped in Paris. May Bowles became a believer there. Her future husband, William Maxwell, was studying in Paris, studying architecture, along with Mason Remy and a number of other people. And some of the first, it was really from the Paris nub that the first Baha'is became Baha'is in the British Isles. Now, the pilgrimage, of course, was followed a few years later by Abdu'l-Baha's travels to Western Europe and North America really on the eve of World War I. This is Abdu'l-Baha under the Eiffel Tower and speaking in a church in Chicago. And this had also tremendous impact in terms of both spreading the name of the faith and consolidating the Western communities in Europe and North America. I'm skipping over the story with Keirullah, who spun off on a side venture, but he had nonetheless, and some of his followers also went off on a tangent, but the core remained and became the foundations of the North American community. So during World War I, Abdu'l-Baha was writing the tablets of the Divine Plan. And in the tablets of the Divine Plan, as well as, of course, corresponding with many individuals and following up on his visits, but the tablets of the Divine Plan lists some 120 territories all over the world and gave responsibility to the North American believers to carry the faith to them. Interestingly enough, it is believed this document that you see on the left, the tablets of the Divine Plan were actually written on postcards, and the translation was also there, and these were sent through the mail during the war. The document on the right is a schoolboy's atlas or geography text, which was used by the students the Baha'i students in Haifa who were studying in Lebanon, and is believed to have been the source of the list of the 120 places. So Abdu'l-Baha may have been using this geography text to prepare these extraordinary documents, which became the charter for the spreading of the faith around the world. Now, there were a great many other things going on during this period of the breakout in Abdu'l-Baha's ministry, where individuals were either asked to move or moved or heard about the faith. I don't know if you can read that from where you are, but Tunisia was already opened in 1910. I haven't been able to discover exactly what the circumstances. New Zealand, the first Baha'i, first individual became a Baha'i in 1913, and it was a single lady who was living in New Zealand, and one of her friends sent her clippings of reports about Abdu'l-Baha's talks in London, because she had English friends, and then she was later taught by a non-Baha'i actress who visited New Zealand, and she became Baha'i in 1913. And when the Duns arrived in 1920, they found already this Baha'i was there. This Margaret Stevens had even written to the Holy Land, and there's traces of a contribution she made to the funds and so on. So it was very clear that she was a believer. In Japan, an individual named John Auger moved from the USA in 1914. China, a Chinese gentleman became a Baha'i in the United States and then returned home. In 1916, Martha Root started her travels. The Duns arrived in Australia in 1920. Fanny Knobloch in Cape Town, South Africa, also in 1920. And Brazil, Leora Armstrong in 1921. This is Margaret Stevenson from New Zealand. Wait a minute, I'm jumping ahead of myself. And at the same time, Abdu'l-Baha was carefully consolidating the communities in Ishkabad, India and Egypt. The construction of the House of Worship in Ashgabat started in 1902, finished in 1919. In India, building on the work of Mustafa Rumi, the first Sikh believer declared in 1904, the first Hindu in 1909. There was an All India Convention in 1920. In Egypt, Abdu'l-Baha visited on his way to and from Europe, and Mirza Abul Fazl was teaching at the Al-Khazar University and had a number of conversions among the students of the university. So again, marking out the countries where there were Baha'is, when Abdu'l-Baha passed away in 1921, you can see that in a way it looks like the corners of the tent have been staked out. Obviously, the map gives a somewhat erroneous impression in the sense you might think that those countries were full of Baha'is. In fact, there were a handful, sometimes only one, in these countries. But nonetheless, you could already talk about a world, about a community which had a worldwide spread and scope, even if we were thin on the ground in many, many places. So moving on to the next phase, we have more individual initiatives. We have Martha Root, who was traveling all over the world. You have also and other pioneer settlers and windborne seeds. And Shoghi Effendi was also, during the first part of the period, working at the erection of the administrative framework and the beginning of the transition from individual charismatic leadership to institutional governance. That's really the period of 1921 to 1937. 1937, Shoghi Effendi launches the first 7-year plan, which is directed to South America. Now again, 1937 is the eve of the Second World War. Europe and Asia were to be totally consumed in that war. So what was the option? What was available? He had the resources in North America, and South America was really one of the only areas of the world that was not affected by the war. And during this, in this plan, Brazil had been opened before, as we knew, as I mentioned, and all the other countries, all the dark blue there, were opened during, and local assemblies created during that plan. The only ones that weren't touched were the 3 Guianas, which were European colonies, the yellow in the north there. As soon as the Second World War was over, the Guardian launched the second 7-year plan, which had its focus on Europe. The yellow countries are the 10 gold countries. The light blue are other countries that were open at the time. But anyway, this was directing the energy toward the continent of Europe, towards strengthening those communities. This was followed then by the Africa campaign. Now here the countries in yellow are the ones that were open during that campaign. Congo, South Africa, the blue countries, South Africa, Sudan, Egypt, and Tunisia had been opened during the period of Abdu'l-Baha, and the Congo had been opened in the 1940s. This, of course, was just a prelude to the 10-year crusade, which was made it possible to really spread all of the rest of the world except the Soviet bloc. We know that some of the stories from the 10-year crusade. This is Ella Bailey, who pioneered to Tunisia and passed away shortly thereafter. On the right is Mr. Nachavani and Handler Kwazina Kolinga. At the time when Mr. Olinga was setting out as a pioneer with Mr. Nachavani's assistant and driving across the continent of Africa from Uganda to Cameroon. Mr. Olinga then earned his title of the Father of Victories by teaching in Cameroon and raising up a number of African believers who then pioneered to other countries in West and Central Africa. The 10-year crusade was not just about planting flags in countries. It had very extensive goals in terms of languages and ethnic groups to be reached. As you all know, the number of countries that were opened was extraordinary, and there were over 100 countries were opened in the first year of the plan, and then these goals also involve reaching out, publishing literature, translating, reaching out to ethnic and cultural groups in the world's population. One example is of course the Maori people of New Zealand. This is the first Baha'i of Maori descent, Albert White, whose daughter Dame Robin White, some of you may know. So, moving on to the next phase is putting the flesh on the bones, and now I'm looking at the period of the International Baha'i Council and the Universal House of Justice. This included opening some of the last territories that were under the part of the Soviet regime. I think over the weekend Sean Hinton was here. He's the Knight of Baha'u'llah for Mongolia. Sakhalin Island was another one of those places. There's also a period of building up national communities. This is a graph that shows the number of national spiritual assemblies by areas of the world. And you'll note that the growth is much more rapid in what's generally called the third world, or the southern hemisphere. But that development is even more, during this same period, we're seeing an extraordinary increase in the number of Baha'is, the worldwide Baha'i membership. Between 1963 and 1985, a little over 20 years, the worldwide membership of the Baha'i faith grew tenfold, from about 400,000 to over 4 million. During the same period, the United States, for example, multiplied by 8, from 10,000 to 60,000 in the first 9 years, and then another 20,000 from South Carolina in the late 70s and early 80s. The geographic shift in weighting, which you saw in the graph of national assemblies, is even more remarkable when you're looking at the localities where Baha'is reside and local spiritual assemblies. Now, if you look at the localities, out of 113,000 localities where Baha'is reside, almost 100,000 are in the third world. So whereas in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the bulk of the Baha'i community was in Iran, Middle East, and the West, during this period, there was a complete shift to the point where now we really say that the largest numbers and the bulk of the community is in the third world. This slide portrays in different ways the result of that. The pie graphs are worth looking at because they compare the distribution of the Baha'i population with the distribution of the world population. We're not talking now about numbers, but about proportionality. And as you can see, if you compare them, the Baha'is, we're underrepresented in Asia, proportionately overrepresented in Africa. Asia is probably because of China. Overrepresented in Africa, underrepresented in Europe, overrepresented in Latin America. But these are relatively minor differences. What's really significant is that the basic notion in both cases is that the third world represents 3/4 of the population, both the Baha'i population and the general population. So while we may be overrepresented, underrepresented in some degree, the basic proportion is correct. The picture on the right simply makes that point visual, because we in many ways we represent the world's population. I want to pause here to make a point that this process has been anything but linear. There have been many major setbacks and disasters. As you know, the Baha'i community in Ashgabat, which was probably the most developed Baha'i community that has existed to date, was completely destroyed, demolished under Stalin in the 1920s. The Baha'is were chased back across the border into Iran. Some were sent to Siberia. Numbers lost their lives. And that community was just reduced to next to nothing. The house of worship itself was converted into a warehouse for agricultural goods, and then damaged by an earthquake, and then entirely destroyed. The German Baha'i community was one of the strongest in Europe before the Second World War, and Baha'is were harassed, imprisoned, and the community banned during the Nazi period. Egypt was a Baha'i community that had been very strong from the time of Baha'u'llah. It was sort of the transit point for mail and communications between the Holy Land and Iran. Nasser issued a decree banning the Baha'is, which is still in effect today, even though it was, as I said, one of the oldest and most solid Baha'i communities. Uganda, you all have, that the house of worship is there, and that is one of the really early communities of great strength in Africa, which was also banned and persecuted under Idi Amin, now come back since that time. Vietnam had a community of something over 100,000 believers. We actually remember meeting some of them at the Palermo conference in 1968. Then with the change of government there, that community was also banned and driven underground. It's now reviving and has been recognized by the government and is coming back, but it'll take a long time to get back to the level where it was back in the 1960s. And of course, Iran, again and again. If we look, even going back to the 1850s and 60s, we know that the vast majority of the Babis followed Baha'u'llah, but sometimes we're missing the word. It's the surviving Babis, because thousands were killed and others were driven underground, and it was the remnants of the Babi community that rallied to Baha'u'llah. Some estimates have said that what was left was probably, no one has exact statistics for this, but something like a third of what the Babi community had once been. So we need to recognize that this divinely propelled worldwide progress is not linear, and that the setbacks are an inherent part of it. The graphs you've seen also have their ups and their downs, but when you look at the picture overall, it's one of extraordinary strength and continuation. Now, it's also worth remembering that when we look at the process as a whole that we've been talking about, this is also a period that has been marked by 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and innumerable regional conflicts and deep social divisions. So with these adverse conditions, the result is all the more remarkable. I saw a hand there. I'm going to conclude shortly, and we could have some questions. So where are we now? The Baha'i faith is second in its geographic spread after Christianity. firmly implanted at the grassroots, united and dynamic worldwide community, reflected here by the most recent international convention. And perhaps most importantly, for the future, including a vibrant representation of the younger generations, the youth and the children who will be the future of this community. Now, we are, of course, we're going to be talking tomorrow about the movement of populations toward Baha'u'llah in the 21st century. And the point here really is that by the end of the 20th century, we had achieved a certain critical mass, a certain momentum, and especially this worldwide spread and representativity of the world population that is now the basis for moving forward. What we didn't manage to do in this period, while we put flesh on the bones, we didn't manage to find the systems and the tools to consolidate those communities properly and make them sustainable, and which is absolutely essential sort of for the next stage of growth. So we've looked today at this tremendous building process, and quite miraculous building process over 150 years. And then we're going to talk about sort of how we move on, how we have been moving on under the guidance from the House of Justice, and what we'll be doing in the time ahead.